Loibner-Waitkus.
Oh, you make me feel mighty real. San Francisco, I say.
That looks innocent enough, doesn't it? Lots of young people hitchhike. Seems like a good way to get from one place to another. But sometimes there are dangers involved that never meet the eye. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly. One never knows when the homosexual is about. Let's take the case of Jimmy Barnes. Jimmy played baseball all afternoon, and he didn't feel like walking home, so he decided to thumb a ride. He'd done it 100 times before, and he didn't think anything was unusual when the driver struck up a friendly conversation. In fact, he seemed like a real nice guy. What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly, if they try to win your confidence too quickly, and if they become overly personal. One never knows when the homosexual is about. He may appear normal.
Okay, I'm Alan Loibner-Waitkus, and this is American Literature 1865 through present, and we just did a Harlem Renaissance video on history. And now we're doing a little more. Originally, this was going to be on Stonewall and around the period that Ginsberg was writing, which actually happened a little after he was writing. But I was going to go through this because we're coming up on two gay writers, James Baldwin and Allen Ginsberg. Baldwin won't address, nothing in his story is particularly gay, but Ginsberg will address some issues and things like that. So I wanted to do this video for that reason, and for future stuff. And the other thing is, when I teach in my on-campus classes, I've discovered over the years that students just don't know this information. And this is the civil rights movement of our lifetime. I didn't live through. Now, while, don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing this to, blacks are still going through stuff, right? Women are still having to fight for things. But, this has been, it seems to me weird. We know that. We're taught the African-American civil rights movement. We're taught the feminist movement, but nobody really addresses these gay issues. And I think there's a couple of reasons: because it's controversial, because students will refuse to listen to any of it and kind of tune it out, because it's still developing. All of those reasons, and I'm not scared to. So we're going to go through this now. Before we start, let me kind of say the term homosexual and gay. What's the better term? According to the Gay and Lesbian Association Against Defamation, gay is the preferred term because homosexual seems more scientific, more like you've got some sort of condition, that there's something wrong. And so they don't. So if you think calling someone, using gay is pejorative, it's not. So don't be scared of that. Now, I'll go back and forth between the terms depending on usage because that matters a little bit. But we know that gay men and lesbians have existed since the beginning of time, right? Those acts happen. Now, what makes this minority so different than other minorities is it can be hidden relatively easily, right? From yourself as well as from the public. And so it adds a different sort of sense of control. You can't, and I cannot stress enough, I do not equate the two movements. They're very different. But Sandra Bernhard, who we started with a song by her, was once asked what was the difference between being black and being gay, and she said you didn't have to tell your parents you're black, right? So now, when you're born a minority, you're born into a minority group, okay? Your family shares that with you. Gay is unique in that situation, that A, it can be hidden, and B, it can, you're not necessarily in a support group. In fact, we know that a lot of parents aren't supportive, and we also know how much that increases the suicide rate and other problems. In fact, Dan Savage once had a sort of brilliant quote where someone called and said, my son's gay and I don't accept it. How do I make him not gay? And the response was, you don't have a choice. Savage said, you don't have a choice. You have a gay child. How you handle it determines on whether or not you have a living child. And that really struck me as a great line and really emotional, and I think he's dead on there. Now, the Holocaust, really as far as history goes, that's the first time we start teaching stuff to do with gay people. And again, it's heavily avoided. Paragraph 175, that's the famous paragraph in Nazi Germany that made it a crime. And during the Holocaust, gays and lesbians were, just like Jews, were exterminated, were put into concentration camps, were tortured, were castrated, were any of the horrible things that you can imagine. And from that, we had the Jewish star, the two triangles that created the Jewish star. And so variations of that were used for other groups. What you see a lot of is the pink triangle, which was what gays were done. So again, half of that Star of David becomes a triangle, and they would do it in pink, and that would indicate you had been caught in homosexual activities, or you had, for whatever reason, that would be the pink triangle, and was later adopted by the gay rights movement. The rainbow flag has sort of overtaken it, but that triangle is still used in a lot of groups and a lot of gay rights stuff. Now, in the United States, again, remember, being gay, not being gay, but gay acts were illegal in the United States, and we'll get to some court cases later. But in the United States, really, we generally start off with McCarthyism, because for the first time, and you really need to know McCarthyism if you've had American history, that's that period that Senator Joseph McCarthy is going after communists, after, it sort of becomes a witch hunt. In fact, the book The Crucible is an allegory of that. It's not really about the Salem witch trials as much. I mean, it is on the surface, but it's really about McCarthyism and this hunt for communists in Hollywood and gays and lesbians and that kind of thing. And McCarthy had laws passed basically saying that if you were gay, you could, be punished for that. You certainly couldn't work for the government because you would be blackmailed and couldn't be trusted. So you'd be spying for the enemies. If they found out, then they could, out you to everyone, and so the enemies had control over you, and so that was his excuse for, firing gays and lesbians and not allowing them to work with the government, all of that other kind of stuff. Now, the irony there, of course, is if the public didn't have a problem with it, then there wouldn't be any reason to blackmail you. But apparently the irony was lost on people at the time and McCarthy. I opened with that video. That was really the attitude, this attitude that, to be gay, you were a sexual deviant, you were a pedophile, you were mentally ill. Which brings us to the next thing. As part of the McCarthy push, the American Psychological Association in their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual said in 1952 that being gay was a mental illness. And that was actually not pulled out till 1973. Again, a lot of politics goes into those groups. McCarthyism kind of forced them into that, even though a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists openly said this is not a mental illness. It took until, 21 years later in 1973 to get them removed from the journal. And so you've got two things going against you here. Three. Society didn't accept it. Two, it was a crime. And finally, you were seen as mentally ill. Now, as far as gay rights groups go, the Medellin Society in 1950 was formed in Los Angeles and spread a little bit. And this was sort of the very, women would wear dresses. They were very, try to look normal, but push for rights, and were not particularly effective. So we kind of move on, and gays are sort of hiding it. And just like African Americans went to large cities, gays and lesbians did the same thing. Again, if you grow up in a small town, being gay was not acceptable, and discovered that places like San Francisco, and San Francisco's got a history of its own, right? A lot of that has to do with, it was a naval place and it became this sort of gay mecca. But New York, Greenwich Village particularly, Christopher Street, which is where the Stonewall Inn is located, became the two, Christopher Street and Castro Street in San Francisco became these two meccas for gay men and lesbians, around after the 50s, and so on. And so on June 28th, 1969, now you have to kind of understand how gay bars went. It was against the law to associate with other gay people. Okay, just being in a room, and this all goes back to that McCarthyism idea. That's what kind of shut down a lot of the African American civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the gay rights movement. Was anytime you were getting together trying to get laws changed or to get something to happen, you were questioning the government, and under McCarthyism, you didn't do that. And so the laws were still around, even in New York City in 1969, that gay establishments were not legal, that men could not dance with men and be together in groups. And so the mafia owned the gay bars. And what they would do is, we know the mafia is in bed with the police in a lot of cities, and so what the mafia would do is, which is odd, that's a weird association, but they knew that there was money to be made there, right? And so what they would do is they would have their inside people at the police department let the gay bars know they were going to be busted that night, and they would blink the lights, and you would either get out or find a woman, if you were a man, or a man find a, whatever, someone of the opposite gender to dance with, and try to make it look as straight as possible to get away with it. And they would just arrest mass amounts of people if they caught them. And even if you were innocent, and this actually relates a little bit to Burns Park and Little Rock, or North Little Rock, believe it or not. But if you were arrested, what you did was you just pled guilty and hoped it went away. Okay, rather than, you didn't want to fight it, because then you were going to make the news, and your name was going to be in the newspaper anyway, in the crime beat. But you kind of hoped nobody would notice, and your employer wouldn't notice, and you could just go on living your life. Now, I brought up the Burns Park thing, which seems like a weird reference, but they have actually had to put laws in place. And no, I've never been arrested. I don't even know if I've been to Burns Park since I was a high school kid playing tennis, but they had to put things in place, because similar accusations were being made that men were being arrested. A cop would claim that the man had solicited him for sex, and then it would be the man's word against the cop, and most of the men just pled guilty because they didn't want, even if they were innocent, because they didn't want their wives or families or employers to find out that they had been arrested for this. And so a lot of innocent people probably pled out on these charges. And so now they put things in place where you actually they have to have more proof than just the cop's word against the person's word. So anyway, back to the Stonewall riots. Now, there is some mythology. Judy Garland, who's a huge gay icon, and mother of another huge, of course she played Dorothy in Wizard of Oz, and mother of another huge gay icon, Liza Minnelli, died a few nights before, I think June 22nd, 1969. She'd just been laid to rest. So there's a lot of rumors that the gays were just had it, that this icon was dead and they just weren't going to take crap anymore. Now, the eyewitnesses who were there say they don't ever remember Judy Garland even being brought up, but there was a mood that night that they weren't going to take anything, and in come the cops. No warning from the mafia, nothing, and they begin arresting people. And so the men and women, and again, a lot of this, the reason the movie Stonewall that just came out did so poorly was because it was not supported by the gay community, because they whitewashed this. Most of, the fighting was done by a lot of people of color, a lot of transgendered people, and they try to kind of whitewash this. And so they, because again, those aren't the group, we want to have some hometown all-American boy to be the one who does the fighting, and that wasn't the case here. And they just decided they weren't going to take this anymore. They'd had enough, and so they pushed back. And, it was particularly effective, and there's some accounts that are kind of humorous, drag queens who filled their purses with coins from parking meters they'd broken and are fighting off the police with those. And also, the rioters figured out the police tactics, which was to push back, that if they went down the side streets and came back, if they went down the side streets and came back around, they would be behind the cops. And so, nobody had really thought of this before about how to, not have your riot controlled. And so it went on throughout the evening, began up the next night, and then sort of, continued for a few days. And it depends on who you talk to. Gay rights advocates will claim that it was, they had won victory and the police gave up. The police will say, no, we controlled the situation. The point was, it was the first time that a group this large had come forward and said, we're not going to take this. And so it was seen as the birth of this movement, and people started, including Ginsburg, comments. You can Google a comment from Ginsburg. He lived in Greenwich Village when this happened and made the comment that, finally the gays had risen. Even though he didn't take part in the riots, he, was in the middle of sort of the situation. Now, post Stonewall, okay, June is Gay Pride Month, right? You're familiar with that. And again, that's because that's when the Stonewall riot happened. The next year, on the anniversary, New Yorkers organized the first Gay Pride Parade. And it started as just a few people marching. And the next thing, you can look at some accounts of very emotional people who said, they were a group of 20 and they turned around and they were being followed by 2,000. Okay. And so the next thing it just becomes this huge thing. The following year, San Francisco started its own gay pride parade. And so all of these gay pride parades you see everywhere, including coming up in Little Rock soon, all really came out of these Stonewall riots. Now, the Gay Liberation Front was formed soon after that. And what makes this group, it was a group fighting for gay rights, what made this group unique is that for the first time they actually used gay in the title of their organization. Hey, Harvey Milk, we're going to hit on some other little history stuff, was the first publicly, we know that, and there's the movie starring Sean Penn that won the Academy Awards, was elected in 1977 as just a city supervisor, which basically is an alderman or city councilman from San Francisco. But he was the first openly gay man elected to an office of that caliber. And it became, a very famous thing. And he was very openly gay. In fact, he has a famous line that, if a bullet should ever enter his brain, he hopes it goes through every closet door. He was a firm believer that the secret to gay rights was getting everyone who was gay to come out, so that, it's, again, we saw that with Dick Cheney, right? It's a lot harder to hate gay people when you know him. When his daughter came out, all of a sudden he supported same-sex marriage. And, so that was Milk's idea, even in the 70s, that we do that. In 1978, Dan White, who was another supervisor in San Francisco, so another city councilman, assassinated Harvey Milk, and the mayor at the time, Mayor Moscone, who he felt sided with Harvey Milk. And so he assassinated both men and was arrested and charged with murder. Now, what's interesting is we have our next big famous gay riot that's not mentioned as much, but on May 21st, 1979, the jury found him guilty of only manslaughter and pretty much gave him a slap on the wrist. He used, there's a lot of mythology with this, the Twinkie defense, and again, how effective this was or how used it was, we're not 100% sure, but Dan White basically had said he'd been eating a whole lot of junk food in the days up to the murder, and that affected his brain, and that's why he did this. Now, the jury has people who served on the jury have been interviewed since then and have said the Twinkie defense wasn't really it, but they have said, had he assassinated just Mayor Moscone, he probably would have gotten life in prison without the possibility of parole. But because he killed this gay man, that somehow made it okay or better, and he was only found guilty of manslaughter. So when that manslaughter verdict was read, people in Castro Street, which again is the gay Mecca in San Francisco, joined together and took the fight to City Hall. And, caught cars on fire, rioted, all of those things, and it became a huge moment. Now, the effect that it had, too, was Again, this uniting politically of the group. And Dianne Feinstein, the senator from New York now, or from, I'm sorry, California, she and Senator Box are the only two women to be senators from a single state. She was elected mayor following Moscone's assassination, and she vowed politically to work with gay groups and actually hired a chief of police who was gay friendly and did a lot that worked, had the gay community and the police to work together better in a way. So there was something positive that came out of this. Now, also in 1979, Gilbert Baker sewed the rainbow flag that you see today. It had turquoise and pink in it at the time, but because those colors were difficult to produce, those colors dropped from it, and that became really, that and the pink triangle are the two big symbols of the civil rights movement. You see the rainbow flag a lot more commonly, but when I was in college, you saw the pink triangle more often than I saw the rainbow flag. And that kind of changed over in the mid-90s as far as my perspective and what I saw. AIDS hit in 1981. And what's unique about this, again, is it was not just a gay disease, but it was mostly a gay disease. It was, predominantly the people who died from it were gay. That didn't say everybody else was immune, but so what it did was force these people out of the closet, right? It was hard to deny to your family anymore that you weren't gay when you had AIDS. And so it forced this visibility that couldn't, they couldn't hide anymore. And so it became very political. We know that, Reagan attempted to pull funding from the Center for Disease Control because, according to people behind the scenes, and again, this has not been confirmed, but, he felt it was killing the right people. We know thousands had died before Reagan ever uttered the word AIDS because of who it was killing. And from this, we actually have, Harvey Milk is seen by many to be the gay rights movement does not have its Martin Luther King Jr. It doesn't have its Gloria Steinem or Betty Friedan, right? There's no, and Harvey Milk is as close as a lot of people will go. I think history is going to really be much kinder to a man named Larry Kramer. Okay, Larry Kramer was, not happy about the AIDS thing. Now, the reason he's controversial is when it was discovered what the cause was, he wanted the mayor of New York to shut down bathhouses. He was telling gay men to stop having sex unprotected and to stop, having multiple partners and that kind of thing, which was incredibly unpopular, as you can imagine. But, it was a life or death sort of situation. So there was that issue. And then he started with some other people, the Gay Men's Health Crisis, and the group was not happy with him because he was sort of in your face about the whole thing. He wanted it to say gay men's health crisis on these envelopes and stuff. And Larry Kramer wrote in 1985, or was produced in 1985, The Play the Normal Heart, which goes through this period between 1981 and 1984. And he does a really good job, I think. And they made it into an HBO movie or miniseries a couple of years ago with Julia Roberts and a lot of other famous people. But he was forced out of the board of the Gay Men's Health Crisis because he was so in your face. And in 1987 started ACT UP, which was a very aggressive group that got attention drawn to AIDS, and AIDS particularly, but gay rights as well, by doing in-your-face stuff and sort of, busting into talk shows and different events to draw attention to this. Okay, now in the 90s, we had and people question this. Why do gay people like Bill Clinton so much? He signed two horrible pieces of legislation against that hurt gay men and lesbians, they feel. But when you're a political pawn, I think you kind of understand what people are doing, and that Bill Clinton needed to do this for other reasons. And Bill Clinton was one of the first politicians to come out openly in support of same-sex marriage. So I think, while there's still some hard feelings with the community, a lot of things have been forgiven. The first one was Don't Ask, Don't Tell, okay, which allowed, if you didn't live through it or weren't old enough, a lot of people see that as, taking away the First Amendment rights of gays and lesbians. But this is what gave gay men and lesbians the right to serve in the military. Okay, they just could not serve openly. Don't ask, the military wouldn't ask, and don't tell. And yes, you could be dishonorably discharged should you be caught or you admit to being a gay man or a lesbian. And we know, the percentage of lesbians in the military is remarkably high. So there was no secret there before, but you didn't. Again, for once, you weren't asked, you weren't sought out. And that was eventually, that passed in 1993. It wasn't implemented until 1994 and signed by Bill Clinton in 93, but it was implemented in 1994. So the dates are weird here. And it was actually overturned in 2010, but there was sort of a stalling period there. So it wasn't until 2011 that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was overturned. And so now, and again, that's only 5 years ago. Now gay men and lesbian can openly serve in the military. Another important thing that happened in that period was Lawrence versus Texas. And this was a situation, remember, most states had sodomy laws on the books. If you were caught, if you were doing gay acts, you could be arrested and charged with a crime. And the problem was, to get it to go to the Supreme Court, somebody had to be caught, and you couldn't, you basically, how often do people walk in on somebody copulating, right? And finally, there was a case where police had a search warrant, busted into a house for an unrelated crime, and walked in on Lawrence and another man having sex, and ultimately charged him with sodomy. And he took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court and won. Okay, in Lawrence versus Texas. So that's less than 20 years ago. I mean, I remember that like it was yesterday when that happened. And the interesting thing there is Anton Scalia, the Supreme Court, the very conservative Supreme Court justice who just died, made the comment in 2003 when it passed that it would lead to gay marriage, that overturning these sodomy laws would lead to gay marriage, and he was right. Now, if that may or may not be the reason, but we'll look in. You can look into that. The other thing too here, you just can't you can't talk about gay rights and marriage equality without talking about the marriage equality movement. And that, has always been talked about, but it really became something people were like, this could happen. In 1993 in Hawaii, Bear versus Lewin was a court case that the Hawaiian Supreme Court actually said, nope, you can't tell two people of the same gender they can't marry, and that was eventually overturned in a higher court. Okay, and remember, in this country, so many things that we consider laws aren't laws; they're decided on court precedent. Whether it be the Supreme Court or lower court, should the Supreme Court not take it. And in response to this, people started kind of freaking out. Oh no, gay people are going to be married soon. And so the Republican House and Senate passed through the Defense of Marriage Act in 1996. Basically saying that you did not have to, one state wouldn't be recognized by the federal government, and one state did not have to recognize another state's marriage. Now, what's interesting is in Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court had already said that couldn't apply because you had Loving, who was a African-American man, a white man marrying an African-American woman in Virginia, and they were arrested, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't have these laws that aren't consistent on marriage. So, but it still took a significant amount of time for that to happen in the U.S. Again, DOMA was signed by Bill Clinton in 1996, another sort of unpopular thing. In Massachusetts in 2004, a court said, no, you have to allow gay marriage. And the state didn't question it. The state was more liberal than most, and so for the first time in 2004, we had a state that allowed same-sex marriage. Now, we saw a sort of trickling of that to one or two or three more states, and till it was, I think, about 13. And then we had the United States versus Windsor, which is a Supreme Court case in 2011, where Edith Windsor said basically her wife had died. They were married legally in a state where it was legal. The wife died, and the federal government said, you have to pay the estate tax, which is what you pay. Now, think about it. If you're straight and married, your wife or husband dies, all the money just goes over to you. You don't have to pay tax. You don't have to pay inheritance taxes, right? But if you were a same-sex couple, you did. And so she sued and said, I'm not going to pay this $300 and something thousand that the federal government wants me to pay. I was married, and it should be recognized. And while that was not the case that said it had to be legal in every state, it did tell the federal government, you have to recognize this marriage. You can't make her pay estate taxes. And it was really the second to last domino before the final one fell, and everyone knew the writing was on the wall after Windsor, and that was Obergefell versus Hodges. Again, a situation with a death, and this time a man wanting recognition of his marriage, and specifically saying it should be recognized in all 50 states. If I'm married in one state, I should be married in another, and you should be able to get married anywhere. And this decision on June 26, 2015, so think of that, less than 2 years ago, basically is what made it so that every state was forced to allow same-sex marriage. And so this was sort of the huge decision, really the biggest decision as far as gay men and lesbians so far in my lifetime. And, is a huge thing. In fact, I'll show some images of, I actually have one of the signs that were held up in front of the Supreme Court after the decision was announced. Now, with anything else, just like Reconstruction, you've got a backlash. We had the whole Kim Davis thing, the woman who in Kentucky who was a county clerk and refused to give licenses and had a lot of support, including from our own governor, former governor, Mike Huckabee. And so you had that backlash, and we're still seeing it now. I mean, Mike Pence signed a law, who's running for vice president with Donald Trump, signed the law in Indiana that basically they're calling religious freedom laws, right? That means that you have the right to discriminate against gay men and lesbians. We've had that whole idea where there was the pizza place, remember, that said that they were not going to sell pizza to gay men and lesbians for their weddings because, that's what gay men eat at weddings, apparently, which was ridiculous. But you see, all of this backlash. And so you've got a lot of these southern states, again, coincidentally, the same states that are passing Jim Crow laws are passing laws, these so-called religious freedom laws. Again, not going to get into the controversy of that because we don't want to offend anybody here. But, most or a lot of people consider them thinly veiled anti-LGBT laws. Now, another thing, too, to consider here is 28 states in this country still allow discrimination. There is no federal law or Supreme Court decision that says you can't discriminate. You're not, again, gay men and lesbians are not protected, and transgender are not protected by the federal government or 28 state governments. So, you can't be, if you're straight, you can't be kicked out of your house because you're African American. You can't be fired because you're old. You can't be, variety of protections, gender, religion, all of those things. 28 states still don't include sexual orientation or identity. And so you basically, in Arkansas, you can get married on, as the saying goes, on Sunday and be fired for it on Monday, and it's perfectly legal. We're one of those 28 states. So that backlash has happened. Now, what does the future hold? That's where the question becomes now. And, a lot of it depends. We see so much is dependent on the Supreme Court. We're now 4-4 as far as for liberals and for conservatives. And so a lot of it has to do with the result of, and remember Anton Scalia, the one who just died, was the most conservative, probably, of the Supreme Court justices. And so the way in which really this presidential election is what's really, it really hinges on that. Now, will they be able to turn things back? Should Donald Trump win and name a conservative Supreme Court justice? Who knows? We don't tend, well, I'm not going to say that, but I was going to say we don't tend to go backwards, but we do in some situations. So that's certainly feasible. And you've seen that on this campaign. You have a woman running for president who's not always been for it. Her opinions on same-sex marriage have evolved, but, and everybody gives her such a hard time for that.
Sorry,
but
I didn't understand the question I heard.
You see that countrywide. The country's opinions changed on that. Nobody faults the country for changing its mind, but she's faulted for that and has run a very openly pro campaign for same-sex marriage, for equal rights. In fact, as Secretary of State, she's had the famous quote where she said, gay rights are human rights, and human rights are gay rights. And so she's used that very heavily as a campaign technique in this. Some people consider her disingenuous for it. Gay men and lesbians, for the most part, don't. They understand her evolution on this and support her in the election. The other candidate, of course, Donald Trump, and his running mate, Mike Pence, do not. They've said that they will possibly seek Supreme Court justices who will overturn Obergefell and Windsor and sort of turn back the hands of time on gay rights. So again, another reason this presidential election is so important. You have to remember, vote. Okay, vote your conscience, and we'll see how this plays out in the future. If you have any questions on this, I know it was long and drawn out, but I hope that gives you kind of an idea. If you would like to call and debate these issues with me or discuss it, I'll be more than happy to. And I'll see you in the next video by James Baldwin, who's an African-American gay man.
San Francisco, I say, you make me feel mighty real. Sylvester, sister, you're an angel walking among us on the face of this earth. You are so beautiful, you are so fragile, you were so real. This brand new life of doing what you felt was right. Don't ever look back, alright? Be true to your heart, do it right from the start.